ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Alice Zaslavsky is known for food. Delicious food. Cooking it, sharing it, helping other people cook it, and getting kids comfortable and excited about eating lots of different sorts of it. She was on Masterchef in 2012. She's got 4 cookbooks under her belt, and she comes from a long line of home cooks and gardeners. She also has a new program on ABC TV called A Bite to Eat with Alice. What you might not know, though, is that she's also experienced food refusal. As the Soviet Union was collapsing, Alice was a little girl growing up in Georgia. Her parents sent her to kindergarten and tried to keep a sense of normal life as they were preparing to emigrate. There were Soviet soldiers in the streets, tanks rolling in, and a violent crackdown as Georgians tried to assert their independence. And in amongst all this, a young, voracious, hungry Alice couldn't keep her food down at school. Hello, Alice.
Hello, Sana.
What goes on with your senses when you cook?
My senses spark up, every single one of them. My sense of smell is always strong. I can walk into a room and unfortunately, going into many small studios, I could tell who's been there and maybe what they've been eating. I can think about the things that I hear. So I hear things in the oven. I hear things in the pan. I even hear sort of the air bubbles popping as batters bake. But I also hear music when I'm dismounting a salad from a mixing bowl into a serving platter. I hear a crescendo, almost like I am watching the performance of these colours and textures tumbling down into
Do you
the
have
table.
synesthesia?
I think I must. Yeah, I've spoken with enough musicians and other creatives to know that when the synapses and neural pathways connect in these ways, that probably I have a gift in that capacity. It certainly ups the reward mechanisms in my brain, and I think it's the reason why cooking for me is not just something that I do for, it's certainly not fuel, and it's certainly not just something that I do for money, it's something that I do for love.
Does the music change depending on what you cook?
Absolutely. It changes even when I'm at the shops, when I'm buying fresh produce. As I'm touching, say, a really glossy eggplant, I can hear brass, like a brass instrument. Oh, yeah, it's sort of a like I can't make the sound, but I can hear it, and I can tell even when I'm squeezing, say, a zucchini, I can tell how long ago it was picked, and if it's fresh enough for it to be glossy, then I start to hear little sharper strings, I suppose.
Do you see colours as well?
I see colours when I'm writing. So I think the reason why I can write a recipe is because when I'm sort of mapping out the ingredients that go into it, I'm thinking about the colours and the textures and the experience of the person eating it, not just actually when they're cooking it, but even when they're reading it, because I think that as a cookbook author, these days, people can access recipes online. They can know how to make a caprese salad from anybody on social media, but they come to cookbooks because they want to feel something and they want to be prompted to action.
This might be a silly question for a cookbook author, but do you also follow recipes in your family when you're cooking?
Definitely not. No,
Right.
And I never follow recipes in general, Sana. I think that's probably what makes me good at writing a recipe, because if I can't be bothered doing it, then I will certainly not be prompting somebody else to do it. And the only time when I try and follow a little bit more closely is when I'm making something that is my mum's or my dad's or my babushka's, because then my parents will give me the look, like, why didn't you include the potatoes in the borscht? Then I have to justify myself.
Well, was your mum like this as well? Like, do you come from a line of recipe riffers that,
Oh, absolutely. My mum probably is the riffiest recipe non-follower I know. And even if she is following a recipe, somehow she'll still find ways to riff on it. And I think that what I love about Mum is that she is so focused on using every last skerrick of what's available to her. Like she made, it was recently Jewish New Year, so Rosh Hashanah, and she made tzimmus carrots, which are kind of like slow simmered carrots with some sort of agrodolce, sweet, sour flavour. And then a week and a half goes by and I visit and I see that she's got a carrot cake on the kitchen bench. And she gives me a slice, and she always gets me to taste it before she tells me what's in it. She gives me a slice, and I'm tasting this carrot cake. It's delicious. It's full of spice. It's got this lovely tang. And she says, guess what I put in the carrot cake? And I sort of rolled back in my mind and I said, that's Sevis. And I've never seen anybody do that before, but that just shows how I think ingenious my mum is when it comes to cooking.
That sounds delicious. And is that generally how she operates? Like she doesn't let anything go to waste?
Nothing goes to waste. So if she boils corn on the cob, then she'll leave that corn water for the next time that she needs to loosen a sauce or add it to a stock. If something is in that fridge, it is going to get used. It's either going to end up in an omelette or a frittata, or it's going to get baked into something. And I think that is just as much a joy for her as a product of necessity, because, you know, I remember in the Soviet Union, Mum would have to just use whatever was on the shelves. And there was a point at which the only thing that was on the shelves towards the fall of the Soviet Union was seaweed, tinned seaweed. And Mum found ways to make a seaweed salad. You know, before the sushi train, my mum was making seaweed salad, or she'd put the seaweed as the texture through a soup. It was what she had, so she made it work.
And did you like it as a kid?
You know, I always liked my mum's cooking, so that's one dish that I can't remember. So the fact that I can't remember it means that it wasn't a source of childhood trauma for me.
Where in Georgia did you grow up?
I grew up between Tbilisi, which is the capital, and my grandparents' place in Rustavi, which is sort of like the Geelong of of Georgia, and also my grandfather's dacha, which is like his weekender. He was a foreman at a metallurgy plant, so he was afforded some privileges, and one of them was this little sort of plot of land. And I remember many afternoons, sort of balmy evenings, watching him potter about in the garden, trying to sneak as much of that delicious fruit as I could access while he wasn't looking.
And what was home life like for you? Where did you live?
Home life was always busy. It's funny, the reason that I had that sharp intake of breath is because I think for a long time I had a very rosy outlook of what home life was, because I was 5.5 when we left Georgia, and in my mind it was this land of milk and honey. It was a beautiful place. We grew up surrounded by family. My cousins, one's 2 years younger, one's 2 years older. My next cousins, you know, again a little bit older than that, and then my brother, who's like the old big brother of everybody, 8 years older than me. And we were always all together. And my babushkas were close. You know, my grandparents were always around us. It really was a village, and everybody would kind of look after each other, and everybody would sit around a table and we would all feast regularly. We didn't just wait for a special occasion for that.
And tell me about the actual flat that you lived in, because it was a very interesting arrangement, how the flats were.
Well, this is the thing, you know, in Georgia, we were part of the communist bloc of countries in the Soviet Union, so flats and houses were given to you by the government, and often you would share the flat with another family. So they were called коммунальки or коммунальная квартира, which means a communal flat. And so families would have a couple of rooms each, and then you would share the communal spaces. So you would have a communal kitchen and a communal bathroom. You know, if you were lucky, you had a little bit more space. So that's why we ended up living in each other's pockets and living in each other's houses, because I think that idea of home wasn't kind of four walls, it just was where you were. And that sharp intake of breath is because I always thought of Georgia as quite a place of abundance. But we visited we came back after sort of just over 30 years in 2014.
Oh, wow.
And what I saw were, you know, dilapidated buildings. We went back to my grandparents', Geelong. We went back to Rustavi and I saw holes in walls and crumbling balconies. And those rose-tinted glasses, that was when they came off.
So back when you were there living in these communal kind of flats, so your family had their own rooms, but you're sharing kitchens and living spaces. Did you ever have a private kitchen, or were you always sharing?
Yes, my parents were lucky enough to be given a flat of our own. So I can't remember how old I would have been, but I do remember that they even managed to get some monkey bars into a space. So,
oh, wow.
So my dad's very handy and also sort of a bit like MacGyver. So I think there was a spot within the dining room that just was spare. So he put some monkey bars up so that I could hang because there was no playground nearby. But the playground for me really was the kitchen. It was this amazing sort of Laminex 80s kitchen. I should say my mum made it 80s, but it would have been probably more like a 50s or 60s build, quite a brutalist building. And it was in a suburb called Varketili, and the colour of it is what I remember most. It was this kind of pistachio mint green kitchen.
I mean, the kitchen in A Bite to Eat with Alice is mint green as well. Was that on purpose?
It wasn't on purpose, but it was clearly something that was in my heart of hearts, because I remember walking in and just thinking, why does this feel so much like home?
Oh, wow.
And when I started reflecting, because my brief to Penny, who put the space together, Penny Southgate, I said, Penny, I really want this colour scheme to feel like like Australiana. I want it to feel like Australian native florals and Australian eucalyptus. And yet when I walked in, it was Varketili.
And you talked about your grandfather's garden at his holiday home. Did you spend a lot of time in that garden? Tell me more of what you remember of that.
I spent every moment I could find outside, and it was either me by myself or me with my cousins. We were always getting up to mischief. I remember one time my Dziadushka Borja, he was in the garden. He was a very meticulous man, and while he wasn't looking, there was a carnation that had just bloomed and it was perfect. And I sort of really wanted to take it home to Mum, so I ripped it off. And you can imagine he was not happy with me at all.
What kind of punishment did you get?
I can't remember what he said to me, but I can remember he had these really steely blue eyes and these big furry brows, and I just remember him furrowing those brows and stealing me with his gaze.
Terrifying.
And it was terrifying, yes.
What grows well in Georgia?
I think people have this notion that the Soviet Union is all empty shelves and rations, but Georgia was the fruit bowl of the Soviet Union. That was where all of the beautiful fresh produce, or a lot of the fresh produce, came from. And Georgia is the birthplace of wine. It's been growing grapes and making wine for over 6,000 years. And it's at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. So you've got the beautiful spices of the spice trail as well coming through. You've got the cheeses and the breads of Europe, and then you've got these fresh herbs that you would normally associate with Southeast Asia, like coriander, and you've got nuts like walnuts in abundance, and that brings the creaminess. But it's the fruit and the vegetables that I remember best, and a lot of those fruit and veg, came through again on the spice trail. Things like persimmons, pomegranates, figs. Tomatoes in Georgia were just as delicious as the ones that you can imagine, finding in Italy, and, of course, big, glossy eggplants.
Wow. So gorgeous produce and ingredients. What are some of the dishes you remember? What is Georgian cuisine like?
I don't have to remember it because we're still cooking it. That's the great thing about food, Sana. My parents make Georgian dishes all the time. And, in fact, I think that one of the things about the Soviet Union that was quite advantageous for anyone that came through that block is that the cooking lent to each other and borrowed to each other. There was this one big book of cooking that was given to every housewife in the Soviet Union from the 50s and 60s. Mikoyan was like the communist head of culinary, I suppose, and culture. And Georgian food made up a large proportion of that cuisine because there was so much that was uniquely Georgian. One dish that I think anyone who's ever eaten at a Georgian restaurant or been lucky enough to get to Georgia has tasted it is khachapuri, which is Georgian cheese pie. And I think this will give you a sense of what Georgia is. So it's a very small country. There's about 4 million people, or 4 million Georgians in the world. And there are 26 different kinds of regional khachapuri.
Wow. Oh, my gosh.
So probably the one that's best known and probably is my favourite is khachapuri ajaruli, so ajarskaya khachapuri, which is the one that looks like a boat. Oh. And the reason why is because it's kind of from a port city. So it's designed, it looks like a boat, and then inside is cheese. And then when it's still hot, they crack in an egg and you whip the egg through the still hot cheese, and it becomes kind of like a cheesy fondue, eggy fondue in the middle. And then you use the crust to dip back into the boat.
Oh
and
my
it
gosh.
is
This sounds incredible.
This is Georgian breakfast.
Wow.
That's where you
Okay.
start the day. And of course with a side of salad.
Is there much Jewish food that's part of Georgian cuisine as well?
There's been a Jewish presence in Georgia for a very long time, and that was the Sephardi Jewish presence. There's a synagogue in the Georgian Old City that's been there for hundreds of years. But in terms of the Jewish food that we cooked at home, it was more like the kind of cooking that you would associate with other parts of Ashkenazi Jewry. So from Latvia, Lithuania, Russia and the Ukraine, because that's where my forebears came from.
And what kind of food is that?
That is the kind of stodgy stuff that you would imagine, seeing in the bagel belt. Things like that chicken soup with matzah
Right.
balls, gefilte fish, which is cod that's been boiled and pressed into kind of like a rissole and eaten with horseradish. A lot of the food that's made for Ashkenazi palates is made because of necessity. So it might be food that's served cold because you can't use heat on the Sabbath, or it might be food that's cooked overnight because that way by the time that you serve it up, it's still warm, from the hearth.
How hard was it for your family to stay connected to their Jewishness in the Soviet Union?
It was hard for anyone of any religious ilk to stay connected. They had to do it in secret, in private. My parents, one side stayed extremely connected to it, the other less so. And it was seen as an act of defiance to maintain a sense of cultural connection to our Judaism. My paternal grandfather's mum, Brocha, would take her children to have their hair cut by the chacham, like by the special kind of cutter that would be on the other side of town. There was no car, but she would trek with her children to do that. At Passover, when we are eating flatbread known as matzah, that was something that, again, was seen as a transgression. And so Jews would find someone to bake that matzah for them in secret. They would hide it. There's like a little game that you play at Passover called hiding the afikoman for the children, but we were hiding the afikoman and the rest of the matzah because that's the way that we could maintain our religion. And even having religious symbols on our person was a defiant act. My parents found a jeweler who melted down pieces and created Magen Davids, Stars of David, for people to wear under their clothing that I've recently, started wearing again and had no idea of the significance because, again, I think that it was, the reason why some of my forebears ended up in Georgia is because of the persecution that they experienced in other parts of Eastern Europe and then ended up in a place that actually, the Georgians were very protective of their Jewish population. It's the reason why my family survived the Holocaust. And then to have the imposition of a new dogma that forced people to renege or to reject their culture in order to be part of this society and this community was very difficult.
Long before you started writing cookbooks, your great uncle also wrote one. Can you tell me about that?
My great uncle and his mother in the Soviet Union, I come from a long line of cooks from all sides and all angles, and he wanted to create a cookbook of Jewish food. And this was the 1980s in the Soviet Union. And the only way that you can get published there is through the regime. And so he was told that he could publish the book, but he needed to do so under certain restrictions. So he could do the copy, but they would be the ones that would put it all together. They would be managing the creative of the piece, I suppose.
And what was the creative? Because cookbooks today are, half photography. Did this one have any photos or illustrations?
This one had no photos, but it had illustrations, the kind of illustrations that you would otherwise expect to see in anti-Semitic pamphlets. Big hook noses, big hats and curly payot, the curls that a religious man or boy would wear. Mm-hmm. All of that stood in complete stark contrast to the pride of the writing and to these, hundreds of years old recipes that he included in this book. But that was kind of the compromise that he had to accept in order for these recipes to survive.
How did he feel about that, though, to have those illustrations in his book that he cared so much about?
I asked my mum about this, and she said that you just kind of learnt to accept what you got. You got what you got and you just put up with it. The way that I hear my parents and my aunts and uncles talking about that time in the Soviet Union is that you had to find loopholes and you had to have a little bit of chutzpah, as you would call it in Yiddish, which is, have a little bit of pluck and just get by, because those were the people that were able to continue to not just survive but to thrive in the best way that we could.
Do you have a copy of that cookbook?
I do have a copy, but Sana, I have so many cookbooks that somehow I'm like Scrooge McDuck. I'm like, somewhere deep in my bookshelves is this hot pink copy of my great uncle's cookbook.
Is that the
of
colour
Jewish
it was?
food?
Hot
I
pink.
know.
Oh, wow.
Can you believe it? Like a fuchsia.
Huh. Have you cooked any recipes from the book?
I haven't cooked any recipes from the book, but that's because my mum has been able to convey and relay a lot of these kinds of combinations. And sometimes she'll serve up a dish and she'll say, this is your babushka Hannah's dish, or she'll kind of, and so that's what I mean. I think from the perspective of my culture, food is the eternal link that keeps things together.
You were a little kid when the Soviet Union was falling apart in the late 80s and early 90s. What did you see happening around you back then?
I thought it was totally normal, at the time, because it just was my reality. But I remember first seeing some kind of rally in my mind's eye. There's a lot of people around and they're chanting. I can't remember what it is that they're chanting. And then I remember soldiers in the street, just mum and I walking, strolling down the main promenade, because that's where my kindergarten was, and there would just be these men with weapons like rifles on their shoulders. Just kind of, they wouldn't be marching. They would just be relaxing, smoking a cigarette out the front of my kindergarten.
Were they Soviet soldiers?
They were Soviet soldiers.
And then there was a big protest that happened in a main street near you in a massacre. Tell me about what you remember of that.
I don't remember anything from that time, but it was clearly, it's somewhere in there because it was jogged for me. I read a book a few years ago called The Eighth Life, written by Nino Haratishvili, who's a fellow Georgian based in Germany. The way it's described is like War and Peace, but set in Georgia, 8 generations of women. And the generation that's there at the time that I'm there in 1989 speaks of a protest on that main promenade, hundreds of people joining together to protest and to call for Georgian independence. And the protest ended violently. The Soviet soldiers came in and quashed the protest, and 30 people sadly died that night. And when I read that with tears streaming down my face, I went to my mum the next day and I said, "Mum, I don't remember this. Were we there? Did this really happen right where I was learning?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, but it happened at night."
As a way to make it, minimise it or make it okay? Or
I think because they had just learnt that was the reality. And I think, Sana, that is exactly what happened to me as a kid and to them, is that we just had to learn to deal and to continue to be, existing. Because if you kind of just let yourself be consumed by the fear, then that's no way to be. So I think I just must have repressed. I would have absorbed the fear and found ways to compress it down and to continue. And I would have been absorbing that from my parents too, because, they would have been feeling extremely dysregulated and alarmed.
So how much did you understand about what was going on at the time as a child? You might not remember that particular massacre, but what did you understand about what was happening?
I understood that there were a lot of hushed conversations. I understood that there was danger, but I didn't know what the danger was. I didn't feel safe and I didn't know why, because no one talked about it with me. But what I do know now as an adult, because I've heard more of those hushed conversations spoken a little bit louder, is that, my dad was threatened at gunpoint.
Oh, wow.
It was a very tense time. My parents had to sell everything at rock bottom, basically. We weren't allowed to take anything precious with us when we left. So basically we really, as many people fleeing their country do, left with the shirts on our backs and some suitcases, suitcases that still sit on the top of my mum's wardrobe.
Podcast, broadcast. This is Conversations with Sana Kadar.
How did that fear express itself when you were small?
Well, I know this now because of the work that I've done with children with food literacy. But at the time, I couldn't make that connection. All I know is that I would go to my saitik, to my kindergarten, and at that kindergarten we would be fed lunch. And the lunch would often be whatever was available. It would be high carbohydrate, maybe some kind of rice. It was it was gruel. We were fed gruel. It was called shilapalavi, which is like a Georgian kind of congee, I suppose, or maybe between a congee and a risotto. Mm-hmm. It was very gloopy rice. And so, for a long time I thought maybe it was a textural issue, or maybe, clearly I was just a young gourmand.
You wanted something better?
I wanted something better, but every time I would force this dish down at lunchtime because I knew that I had to, and I can still feel it creeping back up and regurgitating back out onto the table.
If it wasn't textural, why do you think you couldn't tolerate that particular food?
We know that food is one way in which children can communicate other deeper issues and traumas. And what I know is that the other thing that I can feel and sense when I think about that time is I can feel the texture, and I can feel this gripping fear deep inside my gut and a scream of what's going on here. And I can smell the smoke curling from the cigarettes of these Soviet soldiers through the window of my kindergarten, and wondering, why are they here and when can I leave?
What would happen when you refused to eat?
Well, they would call my mum, and she was at the applied mathematics, at the university in the applied mathematics faculty, and she would walk down the promenade and she would get me, and she would walk back with me to her office and make me a catletta on rye bread. So, half a risol on rye bread with maybe some satsibeli, which is like a Georgian tomato sauce. And she wouldn't say anything. She'd just serve that up and she'd let me eat.
And would you be able to keep that down? Would that be okay?
Oh, yeah. And I think Mum saved my relationship with food, because she didn't shame me and she didn't make me feel like there was something wrong with me. She just recognised that there were bigger things at play. She never said, what's going on or what could it be. I think she realised that I wasn't ready to have that conversation, but she just met me and met my needs. And I think that she definitely formed something in me to want to do the same for others. That's one of the gifts that my mum gave me, is to continue to love food, even though in that moment I could have become very afraid of it.
And have you tried that dish, shila plavi, if I'm saying it correctly, as an adult? Can you eat that now?
I avoided it for decades, but last year I decided that it was the time. Like now is the time. I'm ready to develop a version of shilapalavi that I think that I can share with the world, and maybe even share that story. And I did so for a column in The Guardian, and I really did have to come to terms with it. But now gloopy rice is something that I welcome and encourage.
Okay. In terms of your parents leaving Georgia, what was the final straw for them that made them leave?
I think that it was a It wasn't just a straw, it was a hay bale, it was a lot of things. My dad had even sort of floated the idea of leaving in the 70s. He was a really kind of rebellious kid. He was the kind of kid where, there were a lot of books that were banned in the Soviet Union and even records that were banned, and he was always grabbing those books, let's say from a friend that had been in East Berlin or from someone that had come from Moscow, and they would photocopy books and share them around with different covers, and they would share these political records around and kind of have these underground parties, I suppose, of rebellion as teenagers do. But when he told my grandfather, this stern foreman at a metallurgy plant, he had 3,000 people that he was responsible for, that he wanted to leave, this man's firstborn and only son, he was told, no uncertain terms that he was not leaving. And so it took another, say, 15 years for Dad to finally convince my grandparents that they needed to go. And they were also told, my parents are both academics. They both were the duxes of their years. They both got the gold medal, so real high achievers. But they were basically told at every turn that because they were Jewish, that's as high as they were able to go in their professions. Between Dad's threats and between feeling this kind of the slow hum of conflict, of civil war, I suppose. My parents left as skilled migrants. They applied for visas in any country that would take them, and it was Australia that opened its policies at the right time, and we came here. But within a year, when my dad's sister and husband and their children left, they left as refugees. The airstrip was bombed after we left. Oh. The shelves didn't just have seaweed, they had absolutely nothing. My grandma, my dad's mum, had bought a puppy just before we left. I don't know if it was some desperate attempt to get us to stay. She bought this puppy and said, "Look, I've even bought you a dog." And then they left this puppy behind, and we sent dog biscuits to the puppy, to the family that took the puppy, and they said, "Do you think those dog biscuits would be okay for us to eat?"
Oh, gosh. Desperate times.
Desperate times.
So you arrived in Australia in 1991. How old were you at that stage?
I was 5.5.
What did Australia look like to you from your 5-year-old eyes?
I even remember the airport, leaving Georgia, looking up at these kind of holy tiles on the ceiling. I remember the weight in my pocket of the cigarette case that my dad had put in there. It was a sterling silver cigarette case, because we weren't allowed to take any precious things. So, jewellery, we kind of hid on ourselves to get it out of there, and any heirlooms. And I remember worrying about that. But I also remember on the flight between Singapore and Australia, which my parents actually didn't have enough money to pay for. We had enough to get to Singapore, and then they trusted that they could find the money somewhere, and friends of friends in Adelaide thankfully stumped up the coin for us to get there. But I remember being on the flight and just beaming from ear to ear. And my brother reminded me, "You know what you were saying that whole time?" He said, "You didn't speak a word of English, but all that you were, exclaiming out loud to everybody laughing on the plane was, 'I love Australia. I love Australia.'" I know. So I remember coming to Australia, the thing that I remember most was the smell. It was Sydney. It was October. So I could remember the frangipanis in the evenings. We would all stroll as a family. I remember that sort of warm stickiness that comes with Sydney at that time of year. And the thing that I remember most is all the great stuff that would be out on the nature strip. My favourite thing, Sana, was on these strolls on hard rubbish days, just fossicking through all of these piles of practically brand new toys and board games and things that were being discarded on the streets of Bondi. And that was the way that I made up my haul.
That is still the case. There's always good stuff on the streets being left out on hard rubbish days.
Make the most of what you got, I say.
So you couldn't speak English still at this stage, right?
No. Besides, I love Australia, and yes and no, I could not speak a word of English.
How did you learn?
I went to a school in Bondi, and it was the early 90s. There was no such thing as an ESL program, an English as a Second Language program. So they used to put me and the other two kids who had also migrated from the Soviet Union into a room, wheel out the TV on a trolley and the VCR, and they would put on Play School. And they would just play Play School episodes, and we'd sort of partake in the activities as much as we could. So I really did learn a lot of English by watching TV.
And how did your parents cope looking for work, not speaking any English?
I think my parents had already obviously built up a lot of resilience, and they were prepared, and they'd also made friends here, first in Sydney and then in Melbourne. But in Sydney there was a small community of fellow like-minded intellectuals that had come from the Soviet Union, many of them Jewish, and they were supporting each other. You know, I have this beautiful photo of us with another family on Bondi Beach, all just smiling and so happy within sort of a month of being in Australia. And what I didn't know is at the time my parents were desperately looking for work. My dad was considering maybe starting to drive a taxi or finding work like that. My mum was thinking maybe some catering. In fact, they even thought that they would open a Georgian restaurant because they're both such great cooks. And they went to the bank to get a loan, and the man behind the desk said, "So what kind of hospitality experience have you got?" And they said, "Well, we've got these PhDs in applied mathematics and data systems and this is like the 90s, and my dad's already talking about the internet." And the guy said, "Yeah, I think maybe you should just stick to your day job." So I could have been a hospitality kid from way back when. Thankfully, though, finally my dad got a job at Monash University in Melbourne. So we all piled all of our stuff into a borrowed Ford station wagon, put the doonas between my brother and I on the back seat so that we didn't pinch and punch each other on the journey, and drove from Sydney to Melbourne.
And after your move, your grandparents came as well. Tell me about your grandmothers, first of all, your babushkas.
My babushkas were both very strong, bold women. They were actually both teachers. One of them got all the way up to pretty much being the principal of a school. The other actually taught English, which I think was quite an act of defiance in Cold War Soviet, in a Cold War Soviet country. And they were both very, very loving and kind of like my, second mums. They were always around.
And what were your grandfathers like?
They were both, men of their time, strapping, stern. They were different. My dad's dad was the gardener. He was icy in terms of like his steely, cool blue gaze, but warm in terms of the hands in the soil. My other grandfather, my maternal grandfather, Dedushka Vova, he was an officer in the Soviet army. So that's the reason why he ended up in Georgia after World War II. He was always almost, so straight and tall. He was, 6'2", big, broad shoulders, and a very strong, silent type.
And your maternal grandparents, they had a less straightforward immigration journey, we can say, to Australia. Can you tell me about their visit in the mid-90s and what happened?
My grandparents ended up going with my mum's sister to Tel Aviv, and that's where they'd settled. And they had started to learn Hebrew. They had their Yiddish, they had their community, and they just came for a little visit. I think it would have been sort of 1995, 96. And while they were here, my grandfather was going to sort of veterans meetings and visiting that community. And a couple of days before they left, my grandfather went to one of these meetings, and it ended at dusk, and he was crossing over Inkerman Road, which, is a sort of relatively busy but suburban street. He was crossing over because he could see my mum and dad on the other side. They were picking him up. And as he crossed, a car came out of nowhere and knocked him over.
And your parents saw this all happen?
My mum saw her father get hit by a car.
How badly hurt was he?
He was rendered wheelchair-bound, paraplegic, practically kind of almost quadriplegic. He was in hospital for months. He was in the spinal ward, rehabilitation for years and years.
It's incredible to have gone from all the trauma of leaving Georgia, living through the war, then coming here, and your mother seeing her father getting hit by a car that renders him quadriplegic.
My mum is one of the most resilient people I have ever met. Stoic, doesn't even begin to describe it, and yet she still has this softness and warmth. I do not know how she managed to get through that. She was still in her 30s, still learning the language, still getting their bearings. Mm-hmm. They'd only recently bought their first house. You know, they were settling, and suddenly her whole life and our whole lives were upended.
Did your grandparents ever go back to Israel, or did they end up staying?
Unfortunately, because of Grandpa's condition, you know, he lived like this for almost 15 years. So they never got to go back to Israel together. But after he died, my grandmother made the trip back to visit friends and see the life that she could have had.
Did your family continue to eat Georgian food in Melbourne?
Oh, yes. My parents still continue to cook Georgian food and food of the Soviet Union. You know, there aren't, unfortunately, every time a Georgian restaurant opens in Melbourne, it somehow ends up closing again because it's a very small community. There are about 600 Georgians in Australia all up. But anyone who's ever eaten Georgian food seeks it out. So I'm hoping that there might be a fledgling Georgian restaurateur that hears this and thinks, okay, fine, I'll give it a go.
Could it be you one day?
It definitely will not be me. I know my skill set, Sana.
Well, in university you studied teaching. Did you always want to be a teacher?
Definitely not. Even though I come from three generations and four, including me, of teachers. My great-grandfather taught at a cheder, which is like the Yiddish word for a room. Both my grandmothers obviously were teachers, and my parents are both, professors. So they're both within an educational capacity. There's no way I wanted to be a teacher. I knew that I wanted to do something creative, and unfortunately, coming from such an academic family, I was kind of told, no, that's not your path. It's not a realistic vocation for you to do something creative. So
classic immigrant story.
Classic immigrant story. And so they gave me the option of doing one creative subject in VCE. So I had to choose one, and I chose drama, and I topped the state in drama.
Did you?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, nailed it. And so that kind of gave me the opportunity to say to them, look, maybe I am pretty good at this creative stuff. And because I'd also received a 24 for a subject that I needed to get 25 in order to do the more vocational course that my parents were planning for me, I said, look, I've gotten a 50 in drama, I got a 24 in maths methods, so please let me do creative arts. And that's what I ended up doing at Melbourne University, which was a very esoteric, very theoretical, conceptual degree. And it was pretty much the place where all of the most creative kids ended up.
So all of that training would have come in helpful for where your career is now, and especially in 2012 when you joined Masterchef. How did that come about, and why did you want to go on that show?
Yeah. Well, Masterchef really came about not because I wanted to lean into my creativity. It's because I wanted to lean into my teaching. I was head of humanities at a top-tier school, DEP head of humanities, and I was teaching history and geography and English, and I was sort of suggested, do I want to pitch in my own elective for my year 8s? And what I found with those year 8 students is that whenever I would take them on school camps and they needed to cook for themselves, they couldn't even dice an onion, let alone cook a meal for themselves. And because I love food and because I know the power of food, I just started to integrate food into their lessons to try and kind of incorporate that into their learning in the gaps. And what I thought is I could do an elective about food and culture to really kind of cement that knowledge in their minds. And when I pitched it, I was told, well, it's a good idea, but we don't think you've got the numbers. And well, you don't have the expertise. You're an English teacher. What do you know about food? You know, if there's anything that I know, it's that if you tell me I can't do something, I will show you that I can. So I went off and did a chef at home course at a TAFE every weekend for a year with a Michelin star chef, Walter Trupp. And Walter showed us how to make all the mother sauces, all of those kind of precision dishes of the French kitchen, but also broadened it out. And at the end of that year, they were bumping out our course and bumping in Masterchef Australia auditions for season 4. And what I thought was, okay, well, I've got the skills, and if my kids see me on TV, then I'll get the numbers and I can do this elective.
And so once you went on, what was it like cooking in such a public way, rather than just for family and friends now?
I think the thing that was hardest about MasterChef is, number one, as a people pleaser, you are cast with 23 other people who are the polar opposite to you. You are one archetype, and everybody who I got along with best in the top 100 all ended up on the cutting room floor because it was me. And so having to find common ground with people who I would otherwise never interact with, even in terms of values and approaches to life. Like, I'm a person who bounces out of bed and is ready for the day. And some people there would be like, hey, can you just be quiet until I've had my coffee?
Okay.
And I think that really shook me, Sana. that already made me feel like, okay, well, what's wrong with me? How do I please these people? And the only way to please people in a competition is to lose, right? That'll please a lot of people. So I just started to sort of dim myself so that I could fit in. And I had one producer approach me after 3, 4, maybe even 5 weeks of this. And she said, hey, I've been watching you. You need to stop doing that. She said, you need to be fully Alice for this because no one else matters. Do this for you. And that was so helpful to me because up to that point I was just kind of, getting into my own head, I suppose. And that's before the cooking. The thing about cooking on MasterChef or any competitive cooking environment is that when you cook for other people and when you cook out of fear that those people are going to be disappointed by your food, it never tastes right. So what I say, and the way that you can translate that into the kitchen, is when you cook for yourself and cook with the confidence that for you, this is delicious. And if somebody else needs to add more salt or needs to add a drizzle or whatever it is, that's on them. All you can do is deliver the best for you.
That is very helpful advice for a very nervous cooker like myself.
Good, I'm glad.
You and your husband, you have a little girl now. Does she like Georgian food?
Oh, you better believe it. She loves all food. And that was one thing when I was pregnant. I woke up in a cold sweat at 3 a.m. just saying, what if she doesn't like food? I've just spent a decade convincing other people that they can work through food issues with their kids. We'd created this food literacy program. We'd done all of this work. And yet now when it was time for the proof in the pudding to be in the eating, I was really afraid. But what I did is when I was pregnant, I ate really widely. When I was breastfeeding again, I was just integrating and exposing her to new flavours. And we always eat together. Even when she was very, very small, even before she could actually eat, she would be watching us interacting with food. And I think she could tell that this was a really special place for us. And I remember the day when she wanted to taste an oyster. She would have been probably about maybe 10 months old. Let's say she was a year old. And she was watching us eat oysters and she was like,
wow.
Oh, give me that. And, there's this notion that food is fun until they're one. So I knew that in this instance, it wasn't about her tasting the oyster. It was just about her touching it and just experiencing it. And I also knew that she had very few teeth. Like there's no way she could chew this oyster.
Yeah.
And I wanted her first experience of that oyster to be a good one. So I pulled the muscle, which is a little bit sort of firmer, out of the oyster itself, and I just gave her the muscle so that she could sort of roll that around in the mouth, get a flavour for it, get the taste of it, and she is the biggest fiend for oysters. Like, we can't leave her with a dozen because we'll come back. We have to negotiate
Expensive
with her.
taste.
Within the dozen. I know, what a big mistake. I made a rod for my own back. But I think that can be applied to anything, any kind of foods. And that's kind of curating the experience for her has been one of the joys of my life.
You have had such an incredible experience with food, such a journey from, growing up with such beautiful bounty of Georgian food, but then living through the war, not having very much, having food refusal, and now to hosting, the show, A Bite to Eat with Alice. How do you reflect on your journey with food?
I think the format of the show, asking people to bring in something that they like or something that they don't like, or just kind of asking people to reflect on their own journeys with food, has shown me that everybody's experience of food is checkered and the power that food plays in everybody's life for good or bad. And I think because I've had such a broad spectrum of experiences with eating and with cooking, I'm able to kind of meet people where they are with lived experience. And I think every time that I have the opportunity to push somebody past a limitation that they set on themselves or help somebody grow in confidence in the kitchen, I feel like I am also continuing to heal my own traumas. And I don't want to even use the word traumas. I want to use the word, from our greatest wounds come our greatest gifts. And that's what it is.
Alice, it's been so lovely chatting to you. Thank you.
Oh, Sana, thank you.
My guest on Conversations today was Alice Zaslavsky, an author of several cookbooks and also the star of A Bite to Eat with Alice on ABC TV. This conversation was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal and Wurundjeri peoples. It was produced by Alice Moldovan. Our executive producer is Carmel Rooney. I'm Sana Kadar. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.